The sky outside was a weary grey, casting a shadow over Mike's small, worn-down house. At 5 years old, he barely understood much of what life was supposed to be, but he knew enough to know this wasn't it. His hands clutched a small, dented metal bowl of scraps and leftovers, carrying it to the alleyway beside the house where a pack of stray dogs waited with eager eyes. They were his only friends in the stillness of every late afternoon. They'd gather around as he poured bits of bread and scraps of meat into the dirt, and Mike would talk to them. The dogs would sit, tails wagging slightly, their eyes fixed on him with a silent kind of understanding. "Mike," whispering, "you're lucky, you know. You guys get to come and go and no one yells at you, no one hurts you." He looked away, his tiny fingers absently scratching behind the dog's ears, his mind drifting to the nights he wished he could forget. From inside the house, a loud thud echoed through the walls, followed by his mother's stifled sob. His small body went stiff, and his fingers froze mid-scratch. His heart pounded, and his ears filled with the dull roar of fear that had become all too familiar. It was the same sound he heard every night. His father Richard stumbling home after another long night at the bar, smelling like whiskey and anger. Inside the house, Kesha sat in silence, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was expecting her second child, but that hadn't softened Richard's heart. He was colder, more violent with every day that passed. She didn't have the strength to leave. She didn't have the resources or support to protect herself and her son. She was trapped, both by the fear of his fists and the helplessness that stretched beyond the bruises he left on her skin. Quietly, so as not to wake Mike, she began gathering what few belongings she could. The bag she picked up was small and worn, but she'd make it work. She filled it with a few essentials, an old sweater, a couple of diapers, and a photo of her mother, the only person she could still remember who had ever shown her pure love. As dawn neared, Kesha felt a soft nudge against her hand. It was Mike, sleepily awake, his eyes barely open but his little mind already alert. He had his own small task to finish before they could leave. They both slipped out to the yard, where the stray dogs he'd grown close to lay in their familiar huddle, waiting. If they somehow knew this would be goodbye, Mike crouched down, his small fingers reaching out to each one, and whispered his farewells. They sniffed him, whimpering in soft confusion, their eyes mirroring the sadness of their goodbye. Keisha watched, her heart breaking, feeling the depth of her son's attachment to these creatures, the only beings who'd offered him comfort in their bleak world. She knelt beside him, letting the dogs press against her too, their quiet loyalty a reminder of the love that still existed around them. Then, with the final goodbye said, they turned their backs and walked slowly, slipping into the darkness that cloaked the early morning. Each step they took away from the house felt like a weight lifting, even though her heart beat wildly with a fear she couldn't fully silence. The silence of the dawn wrapped around them like a protective shield, and each footfall inched them closer to freedom. Kesha held her breath as they passed the fence, clutching Mike's hand tighter as they moved farther and farther from the only home he'd ever known, and the prison she'd longed to escape. The world around them was still, as if holding its breath for them, but Kesha's heart thudded with each cautious step. A sliver of dawn broke on the horizon, casting the faintest light on their path. She dared a final look back at the house. Shadows pooled around the doorway where Richard still slept, oblivious to the life slipping away from him. She whispered to herself, almost a prayer, "This is it, Mike. This is our start." They walked on, braving the unknown with nothing but a worn-out bag, a battered spirit, and each other. Kesha could feel the promise of a new life just beyond the edge of night, a fragile hope that flared brighter with each step they took further and further into freedom. As the bus rattled to a stop at the last station, a small, nearly abandoned gas station on the edge of the outskirts, Kesha clutched little Mike's hand tightly, her mind whirling with a mix of dread and desperation. They had left behind everything familiar, fleeing from Richard's oppressive control. Now, the cold reality of their new life struck her as they stepped off the bus, feeling the cold bite of the evening air. They were alone in a world that seemed all but ready to swallow them whole. The gas station's lone neon sign flickered against the darkening sky, casting a dim glow over the few stray cars still around. Kesha approached the main station, a weary man in a trucker cap watching her approach. He is Thomas. His eyes, initially guarded, softened as she explained in a voice trembling with exhaustion their situation, her pleading for just a corner of shelter for her and her young son. Mike, sensing the gravity of their situation, clutched his mother's leg and looked up at the man with wide eyes. Thomas sighed deeply, glancing between mother and child before finally nodding. Thomas, fine, you can stay for the night. There's a cot in the back by the supplies. Just don't go wandering around. He opened the door and gestured toward the narrow back area of the station. Kesha thanked him profusely, her voice breaking with relief. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of gasoline and stale coffee. But it was a roof. A place at last where she could let her guard down, even if only for a few hours. She settled Mike on the cot, and he, with all the trust of a child who'd spent too many nights in unfamiliar places, curled up against her, drifting quickly to sleep. Kesha, however, lay awake long into the night, eyes scanning the dim ceiling, her mind filled with the fears and uncertainties that still clawed at her heart. Morning arrived with a pale wash of light through the dusty window. Kesha awoke to the muffled sounds of the station beginning its day, truck engines rumbling, coffee being poured, the shuffling of early morning customers. Thomas noticed her standing awkwardly by the door, looking hesitant and unsure. Thomas, how long do you plan to stay? Kesha, her pride swallowing hard against the admission, explained that they had nowhere else to go. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with a mix of shame and determination. After a moment's pause, Thomas nodded again, his gruffness giving way to something softer. Thomas, you could use a little work, huh? It's not much, but if you can keep the place cleaned up, I'll pay you a bit, and you and the kid can stay here for now. Relief flooded Kesha's face as she nodded quickly. The work might be menial, the pay barely enough, but it was a chance, a small opening towards something new. She'd take it. She'd take anything to keep her and Mike safe. The days that followed were hard but steady. Kesha scrubbed floors, wiped down the grimy counters, and refilled the soda machines. Each small task a means to carve out this fragile sense of stability. At the end of the day, she would return to the small cot where Mike waited eagerly to share his day. He would often help her, taking her hand as they cleaned the windows or swept the floor. Despite his young age, he seemed to understand their situation, pitching in with the enthusiasm of someone who only wanted to make his mother smile. Though each day felt long, there was a quietness here, a strange peace that she hadn't felt in years. She no longer had to jump at every sound, flinch at raised voices, or prepare herself for Richard's unpredictable rage. She was just Kesha here, just a mother with her child, surviving each day by her own will and work. Yet, as the sun would set and quiet enveloped the station, loneliness would creep in. She missed a time when her life had felt safe, when she didn't have to work tirelessly just to keep afloat. Some nights, she would gaze out the small station window at the passing cars, wondering if anyone out there knew her pain or even cared. But then, she would look down at Mike, whose small hands had grown rough from sweeping and helping her with odd jobs around the station. Her heart would swell with a fierce determination. She couldn't afford the luxury of regret or self-pity, not anymore. She would press on, no matter the cost for him. In these hard and silent hours, a small hope would bloom inside her, one that told her maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. Maybe this gas station, with its hum of fluorescent lights and endless scent of gasoline, would be the quiet corner they needed to rebuild their lives. The evening draped itself around the town in heavy shadows. It was a cold, biting night when a truck pulled up under the yellowing lights of the station. The guy who stepped out was broad-shouldered, with a worn cap pulled low over his eyes. He took a deep breath, like he was trying to inhale the past. He knew her, this man. They'd crossed paths in another life, one before Richard's control, before fear had tightened around her like an iron cage. As he approached the counter, his eyes narrowed, recognition flickering across his face. Kesha felt a chill crawl down her spine. She'd seen that look before, right before things went terribly wrong. Man, hey, don't I know you from somewhere? Kesha forced a smile, but her hand shook as she handed him his change. The man gave her a hard, searching look, then turned away, heading back to his truck. She could almost feel the thoughts racing through his mind as he sat there for a moment, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror before he roared off into the night. Hours later, that very man was sitting across from Richard in a dimly lit bar miles away. He nursed a beer, glancing around the room with a restless energy. "Man, saw someone today," he finally muttered, leaning closer to Richard. "Man, someone I'm sure you'd want to know about." Richard's interest piqued immediately, his eyes flashing with the look of a predator on the scent of prey. When the man mentioned Kesha, Richard's hand clenched around his glass so hard it nearly shattered. The anger simmering inside him rose to a full blaze, his breathing coming fast and shallow. "Richard, where?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous whisper that carried the weight of raw, unfiltered fury. The friend hesitated, his face uncertain. "Man, Richard, man!" She looked rough. "She's not the same. Richard." "I didn't ask for your opinion," Richard snapped, slamming the glass onto the bar. "Richard, just tell me where she is." The friend muttered the location of the gas station, his face tight with an edge of regret. But Richard barely noticed. His mind was already racing, consumed by a single thought. She was so close, and she was his. She thought she could run, could slip through his grasp, but she was wrong. This was going to end tonight. Fueled by rage and a fifth of whiskey, Richard grabbed a knife from his glove compartment, his fingers tightening around the handle as he pictured Kesha's face. The audacity of her, thinking she could escape him, thinking she could hide. Tonight, he'd make her pay. He stumbled out to his truck, his thoughts dark and twisted as he fired up the engine and tore down the empty road, the headlights piercing the dark like twin daggers. Back at the gas station, Kesha's instincts prickled with dread. She'd been watching the clock, counting the minutes until her shift ended, but every tick of the second hand felt like it was counting down to something awful. The night outside was silent, oppressive, pressing in on the tiny space like it was squeezing her lungs. She placed a protective hand over her belly, her heart pounding against her ribs as she thought of the life inside her, the one she had promised herself she would protect no matter the cost. Then she heard it, the low rumble of a truck engine slicing through the silence, growing louder as it approached. She froze, her blood turning to ice as the truck pulled up under the gas station lights. The driver's door swung open, and she saw his silhouette, broad and dark, moving with a familiar swagger. Richard. The name crashed into her mind like a thunderclap. She backed away, her heart racing, desperate to find somewhere, anywhere to hide. But the station was small, and there were no hiding places, nowhere that could shield her from him. The door creaked open, and his footsteps echoed off the cracked tiles. He moved slowly, deliberately, drawing out the moment as if savoring her fear. She could feel his gaze piercing through the shadows, closing in on her like a hunter cornering its prey. Kesha clutched her belly, whispering a silent prayer, her heart shuddering in terror. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, Richard's revenge would be merciless, and she wouldn't just be fighting for herself this time. "Richard, did you really think you could get away from me, Kesha?" The gas station was eerily silent under the dim, flickering lights, casting shadows that stretched across the lot in broken, uneven lines. Richard's figure appeared like a menacing silhouette against the night, his face twisted with fury as he stormed onto the station ground, brandishing a glinting knife in his hand. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel was loud. The confrontation. Ominous, and with each heavy step, the terror within Kesha grew sharper. She and Mike froze, shrinking back as his voice broke the silence, booming out her name. Venom-laced and unforgiving. "Richard! Ka!" he bellowed, the word echoing in the vast dark emptiness of the night. The knife glinted under the pale light, a sharp reminder of the danger that loomed closer with each second. His eyes were wild, darkened with a storm of emotions she hadn't seen before. Resentment, jealousy, and a thirst for control she knew he wouldn't relinquish. She glanced frantically at Mike, who was trembling beside her. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to protect him, to shield her unborn child, even though there was nowhere to run. The narrow room at the back of the gas station where she had hastily locked herself in suddenly felt like a trap. "Richard, open the door, Kesha!" he demanded, his tone laced with rage. "Richard, you think you can keep hiding from me?" Kesha's hands shook as she clutched her phone, desperately calling for help. Her breathing grew rapid, shallow as she whispered to herself, trying to keep her voice steady enough to talk. She could feel her pulse throbbing in her temples, feel the cold, sickening realization that this might be the last place she'd ever see. "Kesha, come on, pick up," she murmured as she pressed the phone to her ear, praying someone on the other end would hear her. Her voice came out in shaky, broken whispers as she spoke to the operator, trying to explain the terror unfolding just a few feet away. "Kesha, please, he's here with a knife." She choked, feeling her throat tighten. "Kesha, I need help. I'm with my son. I'm pregnant. Please hurry." Richard's pounding fists on the thin metal door interrupted her. "Richard, you think you can run? Think you can hide, Kesha?" His voice was slurred, his words dripping with twisted satisfaction as he kept banging against the door. Fear settled into her bones as she glanced at Mike, who was hugging her waist tightly, his little hands clutching her shirt as if that would make her strong enough to protect them both. She had to keep calm for him even though every fiber of her being was strung tight with panic. "Kesha, stay quiet, Mike," she whispered, trying to comfort him as much as herself. "Kesha, Mummy's going to keep you safe. Just stay close, okay?" She knew the lock on the flimsy door wouldn't hold long. With every loud thump, it felt like it was only a matter of time before Richard broke through with the force of a man consumed by a wrath he could no longer control. Her heart raced faster, every thought, every instinct screaming for her to protect the two lives she held dear, her son and the tiny heartbeat she carried within her, a fragile hope she hadn't yet allowed herself to cherish. When the operator's voice crackled back through the line, a faint beacon in the dark, Kesha spoke quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Kesha, please, he's trying to break down the door. I don't know how much longer I can keep him out." She gasped, glancing nervously as the door rattled under Richard's relentless assault. "Operator, help is on the way," came the calm voice on the other end, a lifeline in the chaos. But Kesha wasn't sure she could hold out that long. Her hands went to Mike's shoulders, pulling him closer, and she lowered herself to look him in the eye. "Kesha, listen, Mike," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Kesha, we're going to get through this. Mummy's here and she'll protect you no matter what." A new wave of determination surged through her as she wrapped her arms around Mike, as if the sheer strength of her love could somehow shield him from the maniacal force on the other side of the door. In the end, the flimsy door couldn't hold Richard back for long. As Richard's eyes glinted with rage in the dim moonlight, Kesha instinctively pulled Mike closer, her hand protectively resting over her belly. The tiny life within her reminded her of every reason to fight, every reason to protect, no matter how helpless she felt at that moment. Just as Richard took a menacing step forward, a sound, a familiar piercing bark, shattered the tension of the night. It was followed by another, then another, until the alley was filled with the eerie chorus of snarls and growls. In the shadows, gleaming eyes caught the faint light, and slowly, one by one, a pack of dogs emerged, encircling Kesha and Mike like a living, breathing wall of protection. These were no ordinary dogs. They were the street dogs Mike had befriended over the past few years. Strays who'd found a kind heart in a small boy and a gentle soul in his mother. The bond they'd formed was invisible, but unbreakable, and tonight it seemed they had returned to repay a kindness never forgotten. Richard's face twisted from anger to shock, his bravado melting, as he took in the snarling jaws and steady stares fixed upon him. He raised his hands, trying to ward off the advancing line of protectors. "Richard, get back! Get away from me!" he yelled, but the dogs only closed in tighter, their growls deepening, echoing off the alley walls. The largest of the pack, a scrappy mutt with a torn ear and fierce loyalty in his eyes, was the first to spring forward. He lunged, teeth bared, snapping at Richard's legs, forcing him to stumble backward. Panic painted his face as more dogs moved forward, a collective force that sent him scrambling in his desperate retreat. Tripped over an empty bottle on the ground, landing hard on his back, the sounds of his own curses muffled by the snarls surrounding him. Kesha looked down at Mike, who was watching in awe, his wide eyes brimming with admiration and relief. He held her hand tightly, whispering, "Mike, they came, Mama. My friends came to help us." Kesha's heart swelled, and she fought back tears as she looked at the ragtag group of animals risking themselves to shield her and her child. The gratitude she felt was overwhelming. She knelt, feeling her growing belly tighten with each wave of emotion, and whispered to the nearest dog, "Kesha, thank you. Thank you for saving us." Her voice was soft, but her words carried weight, as if each syllable was an embrace wrapped in a promise she hoped they'd understand. One of the dogs leaned into her touch, pressing his muddy, matted fur against her hand, accepting her thanks with a silent nobility. Meanwhile, others stood sentry, their eyes flickering between her and the defeated figure sprawled on the ground, unwilling to relax their guard until they were sure the threat had passed. Just then, the distant wail of police sirens pierced the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Richard's face drained of color as he struggled to his feet, glancing around as if searching for an escape. But the dogs stayed firm, forming a barrier that left him with nowhere to run. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights filled the alley, and uniformed officers rushed out of their cars, weapons drawn, quickly surrounding Richard. "Officer." "It's over, Richard," one of the officers commanded, his voice ringing with authority. With nowhere to go and no fight left in him, Richard surrendered, his hands raised as they cuffed him and led him to the police car. The once terrifying figure was now reduced to a pitiful sight, stumbling along in shackles, defeated. As the officers led Richard away, Kesha slumped against the alley wall, her knees finally buckling as the weight of relief washed over her. She reached out to the dogs, pulling one close, wrapping her arms around him, the warmth of his fur grounding her, comforting her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Each of them, in their silent loyalty, stood by her, a reminder that kindness never goes unreturned. "Mike, you guys are our heroes," he whispered, his small voice filled with the deepest sincerity. And almost as if they understood, the dogs nudged him back, their eyes softening, their growls fading to gentle pants. Kesha pulled Mike into her arms, holding him close as she whispered, "Kesha, we're safe now, baby. We're finally safe." She rested her hand on her belly, feeling a flutter from within, as if the baby knew the moment of peace too. The dogs, ever vigilant, curled up around them, their watchful eyes ensuring that no harm would come to the mother and her child that night. As the last of the police cars pulled away, the alley grew quiet once more, but this time the silence was peaceful. In the comforting stillness, Kesha held her son and let herself breathe, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude for the strange and wonderful allies who had come to her aid when she needed it most. And though she couldn't explain it, she felt deep within that those brave, loyal friends would always be watching over them. The morning light peeked through the thin curtains, casting a soft golden glow across the small room where Kesha and Mike had settled. The day had barely begun, and yet the air was already charged with a sense of purpose and promise. Kesha sat quietly by the bed, her hands resting on her growing belly, feeling the slight flutters of life within her. A small smile played on her lips as she felt her unborn child stir, a tiny reminder of the new beginning she had promised herself and her family. Kesha took a deep breath, savoring the moment. Today was the day she'd say goodbye to the gas station and the kind-hearted owner who had offered her work and refuge during her darkest hours. With Richard gone, taken away on charges she once feared he'd evade, life felt both surreal and fragile. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The man who had once been her everything had become nothing but a shadow, one that no longer lingered to haunt her. After a quick breakfast, she took Mike's hand and led him to the small, humble gas station. The old sign, chipped and faded, swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the sound of it filled her with an odd sense of gratitude. She spotted Mr. Thomas, the owner, and felt a pang at the thought of leaving him behind. He had been nothing but kind and generous, offering her shelter when she had nowhere else to turn. Today, as she thanked him, her voice caught. Kesha said, "I don't think I would have made it without you, Mr. Thomas. You saved my life, our lives." Mr. Thomas, who usually had a gruff demeanor, looked down at her with warmth in his eyes. He replied, "Kesha, you're stronger than you think. You didn't need me to save you. You were already saving yourself," he replied, patting her shoulder in a gesture as fatherly as it was comforting. With one last nod of thanks, Kesha and Mike walked away from the gas station behind them. She could hear the familiar barking of the stray dogs who had often wandered the grounds of the station. They had been her quiet companions on many lonely nights, huddling around for warmth and comfort. And now, to her surprise, They followed her and Mike, padding along the roadside as if knowing this was a journey they wanted to witness. The dogs, their coats scruffy and worn, seemed to sense Kesha's struggle. They didn't ask for much, only the occasional scraps and gentle pats, but they gave back so much more. Their loyalty, unwavering and unspoken, touched her deeply. She knew that somehow these animals had become protectors of her little family. Their presence reminded her that kindness, no matter how small, had a way of finding its way back. As they approached their new apartment, a modest one-bedroom with thin walls and a creaky floor, Kesha felt the weight of responsibility settle upon her. She knew she needed to find a more stable job, something that would allow her to truly provide for Mike and the baby. It wouldn't be easy, but as she looked down at her son and placed a protective hand on her belly, she felt a surge of determination. Kesha said, "Mike, we're going to be okay, better than okay. From now on, it's just us, and we're going to build something new together. For you, for the baby, and for all of us." He nodded, a slight smile forming on his face, his grip on her hand tightening just a little as if he too understood the gravity of her words. Days passed, and life began to settle into a quiet rhythm. Kesha found work at a nearby diner, where the hours were long, but the tips steady. She'd pick Mike up from school, and they'd walk home together, sometimes passing by the strays that seemed to find her wherever she went. It was as if the dogs had become her silent guardians, always appearing when she needed a reminder of her strength. And on the evenings when things felt heavy, when the weight of motherhood and the memory of Richard's violent past crept back into her mind, she'd remind herself of the faith she had found in her heart. Richard was in rehab now, facing his own battle, but Kesha had found peace, a strength anchored not in fear, but in love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who could use a reminder that kindness can come back to us in ways we never imagined. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, sometimes even in the toughest moments, we're never truly alone. See you in the next video.